to 7 classes. I know you would if you could, though. Stand by.
Absolutely.
All right, everybody. For those of you who are tuning in after we record this, this is Representative Melanie Stinnett. She is a Republican who serves in the Missouri House of Representatives. And I'm going to share my screen here real briefly, ma'am.
Sure.
Because you represent, stand by, this district right here. This is Missouri 133rd. You want to tell us a little bit about your district before we move on and get to know you a little bit?
Sure. So we kind of call it the southwest quadrant of the city of Springfield. Springfield is now kind of the actual city proper, not outside city limits, is sort of blocked into 4 different quadrants rather. And I have that southwest area. It's a pretty wide demographic, stretching from just south of 60 there. You can see down to Republic Road all the way up to just north of Chestnut. And it's a great district. I enjoyed knocking all through it over the course of several months and meeting a lot of great people. But it is unique in that the demographic is very broad.
I want to give you some respect here because it looks like, I don't know if how much, well, actually, you just got elected in. You're brand new, so
Yes.
you were not involved in drawing these lines at all. But a little respect for having to include the Walmart neighborhood market there. I really appreciate the game there.
Yeah,
all right.
Absolutely.
So let me stop my screen share and get back to you, ma'am. Can you just take a few minutes, once again, introduce yourself? How the heck, I mean, you're brand new. Why did you even decide to get into this? And what's your day-to-day like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a speech pathologist by trade. I graduated from Missouri State with my bachelor's and then my master's in speech pathology and worked kind of throughout the continuum of care and healthcare before opening up a private business, providing speech, occupational, physical, and music therapy in Springfield back in 2014. And it was pretty quickly after I opened that business that I realized that there were some regulations at the state level that were limiting the care that I wanted to provide for children, specifically children with Medicaid. We made it a really big push and a big piece of our business to serve all of our community, and that included children that had Medicaid. However, the restrictions on things like feeding therapy and then the restrictions imposed just by low reimbursement made it difficult for me to be able to provide those services. And so I started asking questions and I started trying to figure out how I could make a difference and how I could change things, and got hooked up with a group out of Columbia, a grassroots group of moms that had put together a group called Missouri Disability Empowerment. And they were really interested in working on issues surrounding children with disabilities, which was near and dear to my heart. And so I worked alongside them on issues of insurance coverage for children with disabilities, seclusion and restraint policy in public schools. But while I was doing that, I was building relationships also with the people that we were talking about to try and make changes for Medicaid reimbursement for these children's services, specifically for therapy services. And so, I don't have sort of a traditional trajectory that you would expect into politics. I had no experience in politics prior. I had never been to a political meeting in my life. And it was really just the experience of realizing that my single voice could make a difference and that my voice was unique in the building. When I came to the Capitol, I often didn't find people with healthcare knowledge. We spend a great deal of our state's resources on healthcare. And so I think it's important that we have some people in the building who have strong healthcare knowledge and understand how those dollars are spent, how they can be spent efficiently, how we can avoid waste. And so that's really what got me interested in running for office, was just wanting to be that knowledge base and that skill set in the building so people could have someone to go to and ask those types of questions. Day to day, I honestly still feel like I'm figuring out. There's an ebb and flow of.
We should mention real briefly that once again, you were freshly elected back in November and
Yes.
You were sworn in January. So you've been on the job 2.5 months.
That's right. That's right. And I think the job changes quite a bit as the year goes on. In the beginning of session, it's a lot of filing bills, doing research, drafting language to work on legislation. at this point in the session, drafting for this session is done. We can't file new bills. And so it's a lot of committee meetings. We're hearing more bills on the House floor now. And then that will transition. Next week, we'll start hearing more, on the House floor about budget and those types of things. But day to day, I'm taking a lot of meetings with both constituents and interested parties on issues that are coming to the floor, issues that are going through committee, or things that people want to work on in future years as well. So I have committees that I go to, session on the floor that I go to, meetings that I have with people that come to the Capitol. And then I go home on Thursdays, session. I come in on Mondays, I go home on Thursdays, and I often have meetings on Fridays, but I also have my regular job outside of this that I do as well. So I do some work in the evenings on that. And then when I get home on Fridays, I do some work there too. We were just off for spring break, so I did some work at my job there in Springfield that week also. So yeah, that's a little bit about kind of what
House of Representatives gets a spring break.
they do. It's kind of weird to have a spring break again.
What do you still work? I'm sorry, you said you work in speech therapy. That's still your day job, or I guess I should say your. I don't know. Would you say the Missouri House of Representatives is your side hustle?
I really don't know anymore. They sort of intertwine so much. They're just all my day job. But yeah, so as a speech pathologist, my specialty is in feeding therapy. I still see some specialty feeding therapy clients in the clinic where I am. My business was bought by the Arc of the Ozarks, so I now work for the Arc and provide those therapy services under their umbrella. But I'm still doing really mostly management at this point of all the therapists. We have nearly 30 therapists that work for us in a clinical and educational settings. And then doing some speech therapy, some feeding therapy for those more complex cases that come through.
Well, ma'am, part of the reason I love doing this is because it's good, I think, for students. We think of politicians very abstractly. It's good to see one in person. I also think it's very important to bring a Republican and a Democrat to class. And ma'am, let's not have them take my word for it. Can we hear from the horse's mouth, please? Why do you identify with the Republican Party?
Yeah, so, I am a big fan of smaller, more limited government. I think as I spoke to about how it impacted my business, government regulations can stifle what our communities are able to do and our businesses are able to do. So that is an important piece to me. I don't want to see government grow by leaps and bounds. I'm a big believer in the individual's rights. And so there are a lot of ways that applies in a lot of different areas, but individual rights are important to me. As far as things like taxes, I think, as a party, we believe in lower taxes, but we also believe in more of a consumption-based tax type system versus income taxes. Taxing people's income is a challenge for me to get my mind around. I actually moved here from a state that didn't have income tax. And so it was quite a shock to me to have to add that on when I moved to Missouri. So there are states that don't have that income tax. Outside of that, I'm pro-life, and that's an important piece to me as well.
So just to be clear for anybody that might not know, consumption tax, man, would it be accurate to say that's kind of another way of describing sales tax?
That's right.
So I'm going to start in with a few questions that students from this class, but other classes have written in since they don't get the honor of speaking with you. Eventually, after I ask a few, I'm going to open it up to the floor. Anybody in the room that wants to ask you anything, feel free to do so. But since you're talking about taxes, we got a good question about that. The students I'm reading in her voice, she says, I see you are in support of reducing taxes. Which taxes are you looking to address first? Personal property taxes, income tax, or sales tax, and how? And I want to add to that, ma'am. I know right now, I think it's the House right now that's voting on cutting the corporate tax in half. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. So broadly speaking, as I already mentioned, I would be more in favor of sales tax systems versus income taxes. I think the tax conversation is a really complex conversation. We actually have a new committee on tax reform this year. So there are a lot of bills. I think that the leadership in the House expected there to be a lot of bills kind of concerning property taxes and things like that. I am concerned, and I do keep a close eye on changes in property taxes, though, because those are the taxes in our system, in our state, that fund our schools, our fire departments, our libraries, our SB 40 boards, which, fund services for individuals with disabilities, which is really important and close to my heart. So I am cautious and careful about those things. I think, though, with the surplus that we have, it's our thought that now is the time to kind of allow Missourians to keep that money themselves. So that's some thoughts on that.
Well, you were just talking about property taxes going to schools. Springfield and Greene County, they're voting on a very large $200 million, I guess it's a tax continuation, it's not a tax. Do you have any thoughts on Prop S, whether you'd like to see it passed or not?
Yeah, I think Prop S is really well done. I think that it highlights some needs for security updates in our schools, which are really important. I think that it highlights some things like the safe rooms, like for shelters, rather, for tornadoes and things like that, which are obviously important. Some safety and security features in schools to keep our kids safe, and some other updates. And so, I've kind of been in touch with people who helped on that task force to put that together. I think ultimately, our voters will decide, but it's something that I think I'm in support of.
So probably one of the biggest things that you guys are wrestling with right now in the General Assembly, and just for anybody in the room who doesn't know, the General Assembly is Missouri's Congress. We just call it the General Assembly. Like the US Congress, it's bicameral. We have a Senate and a House. You serve in the Missouri House. Probably the biggest thing right now in the United States government, we the people have no way to change the law directly, no way to change the law constitutionally. But we do have that ability for Missouri laws for what we call the initiative process. Right now, we have a student that asked about that, say you voted yay for Bill 43 that states 60% of the popular vote will be required to approve constitutional amendments. The student wants to ask, why did you vote yay?
Sure. So I think one thing that's important to note is that my yay vote doesn't mean that that bill is done being adjusted and changed and all those kinds of things. It has to go to the Senate. We know that they'll probably make changes, they'll send it back, and we'll all have to come to an agreement. My yay vote honestly was a vote for moving that process forward. I don't necessarily know that that is the end all be all answer, but I think it's important that we continue the conversation on the other side of the building, come up with a process that is good. We have two different ways to do these things. There's the process of putting something on the ballot which changes our constitution, and that makes it very challenging. Say 5-10 years down the road, things have adjusted and changed and we need to fix something in that language, or there's a new concern about that language, then it makes it really hard as a body for us to be able to make those changes. And so I personally believe that it should be a little bit more challenging to change the Constitution. Now, there are ways to change, make statutory changes, that the people can do that. And I think that that is something that should remain intact. But my yay vote was really to move the process forward. Again, I know that we're going to have a version that looks different than that.
Two more questions from me, ma'am. And once again, I'm quoting students, but this right here is probably the number one question you got. It's on gun rights. I'd say probably the number one question you got. I'm quoting a student who says Missouri has been experiencing a significant rise in gun violence over the past several years. What measures do you believe the state should take to address this issue? And how do you balance concerns about public safety with the Second Amendment?
I think it's an important conversation. I think actually you and I were on a Zoom with the Junior League, League of Women Voters rather, recently, and there were a lot of questions about that type of topic. At this point, I can't really say exactly what I would want to see moved forward, but what I will say is that I think it's an important conversation. I had Moms Demand Action come and talk with me, and I was open in conversations with them about their thoughts. There's even some individual organizations that work in the areas of domestic assault and abuse that have some concerns with guns in that regard, and I'm open to those conversations. So I haven't really drilled down to figure out what I would propose or what that would look like, but I'm definitely open to conversations and having those conversations.
That's the follow-up for me, because Missouri did pass a very controversial bill that would have outlawed Missouri police officers or Missouri law enforcement from enforcing any federal gun control laws. That was struck down by a judge. Do you have any thoughts on that, where you'd like to see that go in the future? I think that was passed before you took office.
That's right, it was. I do think it's an important conversation because, you know, as a state, we make our own laws, and there are certain things that we rely on the federal government for and certain things that the federal government does not have control over us for. And so that's a piece of that conversation. I'll be curious to see how it all pans out. And I think that'll have an impact on what we see kind of presented in bills probably in the next legislative session as to where that discussion goes. But I think that's more of a conversation, again, about how you feel about what the federal government's role is within our state and what our state should be sort of sovereign over as far as how we make our rules and guidelines for things.
Ma'am, last question before I open it up. Last summer, the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, and now the right to seek an abortion is no longer constitutionally protected. We kind of leave it up to quote unquote natural political processes. Well, Missouri is a very pro-life state. Missouri has decided to ban abortion at virtually any circumstance, minus health concerns. How would you change our abortion reproductive policies, if at all, right now? Or are you pretty satisfied with where they are?
You know, I think that the language that is in there, there's been some discussion that it is difficult for physicians to know where the guidelines are. When I read the medical exception guidelines as a healthcare professional, I feel like it's clear, but I'm certainly open to discussions with physicians and other people who don't feel that way, because we don't ever want a medical professional, again, to feel like our government regulations are keeping them from keeping people safe. I think the medical exception is necessary. We have to protect moms whose lives are at risk. But that's, you know, an ongoing conversation. I think that you know, we'll see kind of how that plays out as well.
Yeah, I would like to open it up if anybody has any thoughts. Let's start off with our friend Anna here in the front. Anna, go ahead.
Hi, can't really see me, but hi. I have some family members of mine who, you said you're a part of healthcare services and stuff. Some people in my family, including me, have learning disabilities, and one big thing I grew up with is not having those resources and getting those resources from schools, from hospitals. What is one thing you'd like to see change to get those resources to those children who could end up changing their lives for the better?
That's a great question.
That is an absolutely wonderful question, and I'm really glad you asked it. I am having conversations, I mean, definitely weekly, if not almost daily in this building, because one of the things that has been the biggest challenge and something that really, you know, kind of pushed me to run again is that I believe the state of Missouri over the past probably couple of decades has sort of watered down the services that we provide for children. And I don't think that anybody really did it intentionally, right? I don't think anybody said like, these kids don't matter or these kids do matter. I think what happened is we saw people who, again, were in a building with a little bit of lack of knowledge base in these areas. And they said, oh, well, I'm not sure that really makes that big of a difference. Let's cut some funding here. And this was probably in times where the state was not as flush with cash as we are now, right? So there were areas that needed to be cut because of our balanced budget requirement. So I'll give you a quick example of how this kind of played out for me and why I feel this way. Whenever I opened my clinic and I started providing feeding therapy, I found out feeding therapy was a do not pay code in the state of Missouri for Medicaid. And that meant that no one could bill that code, whether you were in a private setting, you were in a hospital setting, no one was getting reimbursed for these services. So children we're not getting that care at all. And when I tried to drill down and figure out when this happened, how it occurred, why we weren't paying for these services, nobody could really tell me because it had been done so long ago. I think this is what we're finding when we talk about first steps, early childhood intervention, our services in elementary schools for dyslexia, for example. These are things that need to be reviewed with a keen eye, and we need to set up systems that provide these services at the time of the need and don't wait for there to be a problem. We know in healthcare that early intervention, preventative care is what is most necessary and makes the biggest difference. And so I think finding ways to identify potential for concern and inserting that care before it is absolutely detrimental to their learning is the best way. Now, separate from that is how much control do I have over, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education or DHSS, doing those things. I'm not sure how much control I have over that exactly, but I think, my place on the sub-appropes committee for the budget for health, mental health, and social services gives me a voice in some ways. And then, just being within the building and having those conversations continually, hopefully I can help to impact some changes, but I hope that answers your question. I really just think that early intervention, finding those resources, and there are things that our state should be spending money on. We should be spending money on vulnerable populations, on education, and those types of things. So,
Thank you very much.
Mike, do you have thought? You have a question? We have a question in the back. Stockton.
So you started this career because of healthcare purposes, to represent children and children with Medicaid. Do you think that with the Roe v. Wade, that our representatives aren't educated or qualified to make decisions about reproductive care?
That's a really great question as well. I think that there are definitely some concerns that I've heard, regarding, for instance, ectopic pregnancies. What I'll tell you about the process in our legislative body is that there are a lot of stop points where we get to ask questions and we get to hear from the public. We get to take public testimony. People come and visit with us. And so many times what you hear as concerns are things that have come up in committee, but they don't necessarily ever make it to the floor. They don't make it into a bill. And it's very hard to pass a bill. So anything that has been passed, I think has gone through the process of being vetted and making sure that it has been through that process. Now, that's not to say that every bill that comes out is perfect and doesn't have flaws and doesn't need to be addressed. More healthcare knowledge in the building is always better for all of these types of things. But I do think we do have a good vetting process.
Questions at this time? Yep, your floor, just.
So I'm going to switch gears from healthcare and I want to talk about your environmental stance and what policies do you think Missouri should adopt to address environmental concerns like climate change, and if you have any at all?
I'm just gonna be 100% honest. That's not a big piece on my radar because of my focus. And one thing I have learned in this building is you do sort of have to kind of find a lane to accomplish something. You have to sort of find a lane, have that be your research-driven area that you're in. But certainly when things come up on the floor, I do my due diligence. I don't think we've had a lot of environment related things coming up, but are there specific areas that are of interest to you? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So something that I had seen recently in the news is Missouri's carbon, I guess, release. Sorry, I'm not good on the spot. Footprint, and it looks like Missouri needs to reduce their carbon footprint, especially I think in the St. Louis area. And I was just wondering, where you stood on that if things came to vote.
It's something I really need to look at. It's not something I'm familiar enough with to say right now what I would think or do. I do come from a very large city. I grew up in the Houston, Texas area where, smog and kind of things like that, it's a big concern. So it's something I'm aware of in larger cities that we definitely have to be mindful of.
So I had a far side, yeah.
Oh, well, I had something. I was kind of concerned when you were talking about ectopic pregnancies and miscarriages and stuff, because you said that a lot of these bills have flaws, but I just want to make sure that, you know, women can still receive the help that they need, and like people know that that's not an option.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I bring up ectopic pregnancies because it's brought up a lot when we have these conversations, because it was brought up in a bill in a committee, but that language was stripped from the bill because it was found to not be appropriate. So no.
Just so we're
Ectopic
all- I'm so sorry, man. You're the healthcare professional. Can you take, since you are the healthcare professional, can you take a minute or two for those of us that might not know an ectopic pregnancy? What
Sure.
is it and how is it not fit into what you just described?
Yeah, so I'm not an OBGYN or a medical professional that provides that type of care, but an ectopic pregnancy is essentially where the egg implants in a place that the fetus cannot grow safely, and if not taken care of, can actually be something that kills the mother. And so it's something that doctors recognize pretty easily when they're doing an ultrasound, and they're able to recommend for that mother what needs to be done to make sure that they maintain their life. And so it's something that has been brought up in prior sessions, and like I said, has been stripped from language prior.
Someone else had their hand up. I'm gonna stop it again, ma'am.
Right, this
No,
is,
go ahead.
this is just a question I like to ask people. Do you think that healthcare is a privilege or a right?
Sure. You know, I think that healthcare, this is interesting. No one's ever asked me that question. It's a question that I've heard before from other people, but it's not something that's been asked to me. I want to be honest and say that I think that there can be a combination of both. I think that in our populations that are most vulnerable, like our children who, may not have access because of their family's income, or in our populations of elderly that are on fixed incomes, these are the people that we are charged with as a state to take care of and make sure that they have lives that can thrive. And so there is a fine line, I think, with that. One thing that has come to my attention in being here in the Capitol that I hadn't really thought about in this way, but it did come up in a committee. Somebody made a comment. Our healthcare, as a Republican, we talk a lot about free market and these kind of limits on regulation for small business, all those kinds of things. But the truth is that because of all the government involvement in healthcare, whether that be through paying for healthcare, health insurance regulation, all those kinds of things, we don't really have a free market in healthcare as it's set up right now. And so, getting access to that can be a challenge. So that was kind of a roundabout answer, but I think right now, the way that I feel about it is that we have to take care of the populations in our communities that really need us. And as a body in the House, in the Senate, we have to sort of be able to find those lines where, these are our vulnerable populations that need us to take care of these things, and make sure that that's happening.
Good question. Michael, you had a thought.
Yes, on a slightly different note, do you have any ideas for policy to help mitigate the somewhat often ignored crisis in terms of parental abuse and neglect of children?
Were you able to hear that?
Can you repeat that?
Can you give some policy to help mitigate
You
that?
may need, I can't hear him very well. I'm sorry.
If you had any policies to mitigate the effects of parental abuse or neglect. Is that a fair restating?
Yes,
Okay.
it's an issue that is often ignored, despite the fact it's quite a significant problem, at least in local areas.
He says it's a significant problem and all too frequently ignored.
Okay, ask the question one more time.
Yeah,
As
sure.
you-
He was wanting to know if you had any policies in the realm of mitigating the effects of an underrated problem of parental abuse and neglect?
Yeah, I think that this is an area that I'd like to do more research and find some more potential solutions for. I think you're absolutely right. I see in families of children with disabilities often some concerns of abuse and neglect. And I don't have any policy solutions for you right now that are top of mind for me, but it's definitely an area that I think, again, a vulnerable population, a group of children that really depend on us, and we have to make sure that we have things in place to take care of them and figure out when those things are going on. I know that our new director for that segment of the state, it has a new plan. I believe it's, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's a 1 or 2 year plan to change staffing ratios and change the processes within the department to do a more effective job of taking care of these children. And I'm really interested to continue conversations with him and make sure that that train goes down the track, that he is able to make those changes.
Let me ask a tangential question, ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of the biggest things the Missouri House, and really the General Assembly, is working on right now. Because we are talking about children at this exact moment, and some of the children in Missouri are transgender. And right now, some of those transgender children want to play sports in the gender that they identify with. Right now, the Missouri House is grappling with that. How's the grappling going? Where do you fall in this issue?
Yeah, so the grappling's been all in the Senate so far as where that conversation is being had. They did pass something out this week. I was really deep in, I actually had a bill perfected this week and was moving on to be third read hopefully today, but it looks like it'll be Monday. So I haven't read through exactly what they passed, so I don't know 100%. I have some bullet points of what that language says, but I haven't read it myself. As far as transgender issues, I think that they are obviously a sensitive topic that has to be approached with compassion and care. I do have some concerns, and being in healthcare myself, anytime, so speaking specifically about the healthcare portion of it, I'll get to the sports piece in a minute. Anytime that you have a piece of healthcare that is an area that is private pay, makes money, you have to make sure that those areas aren't abused. You want to make sure that those things are being provided in a quality and effective manner. I think we've seen some potential in our state for that to not be the case, and time will tell what that actually looks like when those things come out. But I do have concerns, and I want to make sure that we are protecting children and making sure that those choices are made in a right mindset. They're making those decisions in a way that or in a time when that decision making can be made. I'm hearing stories and hearing things about people who are detransitioning, and I have concerns about the long-term impacts. I'm still honestly doing my own research about the long-term impacts of things like puberty blockers, and so we'll see kind of where that conversation goes. As far as sports goes, I think we have to be honest, right? We are talking about like really young children sometimes playing like soccer. There's lots of co-ed soccer things that go on through, and up until they get competitive. I think where the concern lies is when things start to get competitive, if an individual is making a choice to play sports in a different gender than they were born in, then if they haven't done any of those puberty blockers and things like that, then their body may be different in a way that would allow them to have an advantage. And a lot of these things are played in a way to get scholarships or other things later in life that are really meaningful to these students. And so I think it's a conversation that needs to be had throughout our communities. It's a somewhat new conversation for our communities. And so I've been open to having those conversations with people kind of one-on-one, because I think those are the best ways, honestly, to have those difficult conversations. But yeah, it's still progressing through the process. I suspect that after we get through our budget on our side, then we'll probably move on to some of those conversations in the House.
We had a hand up earlier, sir. No, go ahead, Adam.
Okay,
The floor, buddy.
yeah, so I just kind of wanted to circle back to the kind of the clean energy question. So it's like in many places we don't really have a choice in where we get our energy. Many energy companies are somewhat monopolies. And I'm wondering, is there anything on a local level, say in Springfield, to help promote a shift to clean energy, to help reduce our carbon footprint? Is there like a credit system or anything, any kind of program like that?
Yeah, so the city utilities in Springfield has some wind and solar that they use within their system. And I know that they have a plan that moves them toward more of those renewable energies. And so I would really encourage you, if you're really interested in those types of things, to set a meeting with them. They're wonderful people to work with. They had some community events at the libraries over the past year or so to share some of that information. And it was new information for me. I had no idea the percentage that they were getting from wind and solar, and it's actually higher than I think you would suspect. So, I mean, city utilities is a great resource for that type of information for our community. There are some co-ops outside of Springfield that provide our electric services and things like that in our outlying communities, both in Greene County, Christian County, and the surrounding communities. They may have some resources to share with you what they're doing as well. But I do know that our city utilities is mindful that it's a conversation that they're always having.
Thank you.
We do have time for more. We do have time for a few more questions. You'll
Sure.
keep the floor open. Let's start back corner, sir. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know if you voted on this or not, since you're relatively new to the House, but the legalization of marijuana was a pretty controversial thing that was passed recently. And I was just curious about your stance on it, and if you would have voted yay, why? If you would have voted nay, why?
Yeah, it actually was, something that was voted. I haven't heard that in the House since I've been here, but, obviously was voted on by the people. I personally, don't have a big problem with it. I think there are some potential medical implications that we should be educating about, maybe through our public health departments and things like that. But I'm a person who really believes that you are an individual and you have rights and you can make those decisions for yourself.
Back wall.
Yeah, so when it comes to gun violence, it's usually the left who tackles controlling guns, while the right is more specializing or trying to when it comes to mental health. But when it comes to mental health, Missouri ranks pretty low on accessibility. So what do you think Missouri could do to address that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. A lot of what our challenges are, and this is nationwide, is access because of lack of professionals to provide care. So even if we funded, we just opened the floodgates and said, fund whatever mental health you need, our communities don't have the professionals to provide the care, specifically psychiatrists and counselors and those types of professionals. One thing that we did just perfect in the House that I worked really closely on was a bill to increase our medical residencies in the state of Missouri, and that includes psychiatrists. And that, I think, is a really important piece of the puzzle. We have to get more providers. The truth of the matter is, if we have the providers, they can bill insurance, right? The funding will be there, because if say for instance, a person has Medicaid, a individual who's a psychiatrist is credentialed with Medicaid, they bill Medicaid, they're going to get paid. And what happens, this is kind of something I've learned, what happens if Medicaid didn't allocate the money, then they would do a supplemental budget to make up that difference, because we have to provide those services based on our federal mandates with Medicaid. So we need more providers to work in these fields. And right now we're in the unfortunate situation of burning out providers who have caseloads that are too high and they can't do their jobs effectively. So one of the ways that I'm trying to help is to get more residency spots in our state so that people will complete their residencies in the state of Missouri. Research shows that if they complete their residency in a specific state, they typically stay in that state, often in that community where they did their residency. The state of Missouri has about 1,000 medical students that graduate every year, and we only have 719 spots for residencies. So 30% of those individuals don't even have an opportunity to stay in Missouri, but it's more like only 50% of them actually stay in Missouri because of the match process, where they're trying to match with the particular area of interest that they have. So if we can increase our residency spots, I think that's a starting point to a solution to getting more providers into this state where we need them.
Ma'am, I want to open it up for one more question. Before we do, what if I'm a concerned Missourian? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can email me at melanie.stinnett@house.mo.gov. I'm happy to provide you all with my cell phone number, and I take calls or texts if people have questions. That's 417-693-2327. It's on all my cards that I pass out in town, so I don't mind giving it out. And so, yeah, those are the best ways to reach me. I also have my website, melaniestinnett.com.
One more question. Evelyn, bring us home, ma'am.
I wanted to go back to that transgender conversation.
Sure.
And we were talking about how there are a lot of detransition stories and stuff like that. So do you think that there should be a law in place to wait until a certain age to be put on these puberty blockers because, you know, they're children?
And I'm sorry, I'm unfamiliar with detransitioning. Does that mean you have transitioned at one point in your life and now you are transitioning back to your original sex? Okay, so anyways, back to her question.
That would be right. Yeah, so it would be my preference that we do set an age to where if you want to make those decisions as an adult, then that, you know, again, individual rights, that's your choice to make those decisions. But I think it's concerning for me to allow children to make these decisions because their brains are still developing, their bodies are still developing, and there could be impacts that would be long-term for them that they can't really weigh that risk at that young of an age. So that would be my main concern with it.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. A round of applause for our guest speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You were with us on a Thursday, which means you took a break from working to visit with us. Thank you for doing so, and we hope to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.